Frank Sinatra said it without looking at her. That was the part nobody in the room forgot. He was looking at Johnny Carson, one leg crossed over the other, left hand resting open on the arm of the couch. And in that posture, with that tone, he said it. The way a man says something he has already decided is not a matter of opinion, but a matter of record. She detonates songs, very impressive, completely empty. The audience didn't laugh. They didn't gasp. They made a sound that doesn't have a name, something between recognition and discomfort. And then they went quiet. All of them, at once. The kind of quiet that only happens when 200 people understand simultaneously that something real is happening, and that any sound they make will cost them the moment. Whitney Houston was sitting 3 feet away. She did not flinch. She was 25 years old. It was March 14th, 1989, a Tuesday. The Tonight Show, NBC Studio One, Burbank, California. She had just come off one of the biggest years of her career. One Moment in Time had been on every radio station in America since August. The week before, she had sat in the front row at the Grammys and watched the room give standing ovations to songs she had already outrun. And now Frank Sinatra, 73 years old, the most important voice in American popular music since before Whitney was born, had just described everything she had built in 11 words. Very impressive. Completely empty. The floor director standing behind camera 2 would describe what happened next in a conversation with a single colleague 2 days later. He said Whitney's face did something he couldn't find a word for. Not hurt, not anger. Something quieter than both of those things. The face of someone who had heard this before, in different rooms from different mouths, wrapped in different language, and had decided a long time ago that the only answer worth giving was not a spoken one. Frank Sinatra had a habit of opinions. He had always had it. In 1957, he described rock and roll in a Western magazine column as brutal, degenerate, the work of goons. He did not soften any of it afterward. He meant it the way a man means something he has thought about long enough to stop apologizing for. By the time Whitney arrived in that studio, the fight had moved. It wasn't about genre anymore. It was about something harder to name. Something in the relationship between control and feeling. The men of Sinatra's generation believed that real artistry lived in restraint. The suggestion of emotion, not the emotion itself. The held note, not the released one. You implied. You didn't expose. Sinatra had built the second half of his career on that principle. It had made him a monument. Whitney had built hers on the opposite, and it had made her something nobody had a clean word for yet. She grew up in Newark, New Jersey, in a house where music was not a hobby. Her mother, Sissy Houston, had sung backup for Aretha Franklin and Elvis Presley and Burt Bacharach. The voice was a discipline. You worked at it every day. You did not perform it carelessly and then explain why it was still fine. Whitney sang at New Hope Baptist Church in East Orange before she understood what singing was for. The gospel was in her from the beginning, that Baptist texture, the way certain notes carry weight that has nothing to do with volume. Clive Davis signed her at 19. What came after was a careful construction. The apparatus around her voice was built to specifications. The gospel underneath stayed visible enough to be felt and contained enough not to frighten anyone. The pop, Whitney, and the church. Whitney were the same person, but only one of them made it onto the single every time. She accepted the arrangement. She accepted it the way you accept a cost when you want something badly enough. By 1989, she had started to wonder whether that had been the right call. The Tonight Show producer who booked that Tuesday, Gerald Morris, who had been working the show since 1981, would say afterward that he had genuinely not known which way the evening was going to go. He trusted Carson to hold the room. He did not anticipate what holding it was actually going to require. Sinatra came out at 11:34. Carson stood up. He didn't do that for everyone, only for men he considered singular. Sinatra sat, adjusted his left cuff link once, and began talking the way he always talked. Unhurried, rhythmic, with the authority of someone who had spent 50 years being listened to. Carson asked about the state of American music. Sinatra said melody had become decorative. The art of the lyric, the real art, Cole Porter's art, had been replaced by something louder and less precise. He was not naming anything specific yet, Whitney walked out at 12:04. The applause ran differently. Younger, faster, a current that the Sinatra applause hadn't carried. She sat at the far end of the couch. She and Sinatra exchanged a nod. Professional. Nothing more. Carson asked Sinatra directly about the new generation of voices, whether the tradition was being continued, and Sinatra, still looking at Carson, not at Whitney, gave his answer. She detonates songs. Very impressive. Completely empty. The silence afterward lasted 4 full seconds before Carson picked up his pen. He didn't write anything. He just held it. The producer in the booth tried Carson's earpiece twice. On the second try, Carson reached up, not unkindly, and removed it. He looked at Whitney. She had both hands resting open in her lap. She was looking at Sinatra. Not with the expression the situation seemed to require. Not wounded, not composed in the performative way composure sometimes is. Something else. The floor director, Don Weiss, would write it down that same night in his car before he drove home, because he was afraid that by morning he would have softened the memory without meaning to. He wrote, "She looked like someone who had already made a decision." What she did was turn to the house pianist, a man named Eddie Dunlap, who had been playing The Tonight Show for 11 years and had never been part of anything like this. She looked at him. She said 2 words. "May I?" Nobody moved. Dunlap looked at Carson. Carson gave him nothing either direction. No nod, no shake. Just waited. So Dunlap put his hands on the keys. Whitney stood, not quickly. She didn't rush a single second of it. She walked 3 steps toward the piano. She didn't turn toward the audience. She didn't turn toward Sinatra. She stood at a slight angle, the way she stood in recording sessions when there was no audience to consider, and she closed her eyes. She sang one verse of "Didn't We Almost Have It All?" No backing track, no lights positioned for the moment, no production of any kind. Just the piano and her voice in a television studio at 12 minutes past midnight. She did not detonate anything. That was the thing about it that nobody in the room was prepared for. She did not reach for the note that ends conversations. She found every note exactly where it was supposed to be and set it there. Precise, controlled. But underneath the control, something that cannot be produced by control alone. Something that has no technical name. Something you locate not by analyzing the mechanics of a voice, but by what happens in your chest when you hear it. She stopped after 1 verse. She sat back down. Frank Sinatra did not speak for 13 seconds. Don Weiss counted. He counted because his hands needed something to do, and that was the only task available. What Sinatra said when those 13 seconds were finished was 4 words. He said them quietly, not to Carson, not to the audience, in the direction of the far end of the couch. She knows what it means. The camera operator on camera 1 set down his headset and looked at the floor. Weiss wrote those 4 words in the parking lot at 1:15 in the morning. He wrote the date. He wrote the time. He folded the paper and put it in his coat pocket and did not show it to anyone for 3 years. When he finally did, a colleague at a production meeting in 1992, he said he had held on to it because he was certain that without it, nobody would believe the sequence had happened the way it happened. That paper is part of the Don Weiss collection at the Paley Center for Media in New York. Researchers have reviewed it. It is cataloged under an access-restricted entry dated 2004. Carson called the commercial break at 12:17. The exhale that moved through the studio was loud enough that the boom microphone above the couch picked it up. That audio exists in the raw production files from that evening. Never broadcast, never released. During the break, Sinatra sat completely still, not shut down, not absent. The specific stillness of a man thinking about something that has caught him off guard and has decided everything else in the room can wait. When the cameras came back, he started talking about the first time he recorded in the wee small hours. Nobody had asked. There was no transition. He described standing in the Capitol Records booth in 1955, listening to the playback and understanding for the first time that he was not performing the song. The song was performing him. He had never told that story in any interview. He would never tell it in another one. Whitney listened without moving. Carson let the segment run 9 minutes past its scheduled end. Nobody in the booth called cut. After the studio cleared, Sinatra and Whitney stood together in the corridor outside Studio 1 for 6 minutes. No producers, no cameras. One witness, a Tonight Show researcher named Patricia Holloway, who wrote 3 paragraphs on the back of a call sheet before she drove home. Those notes are in private hands. They have been read by one person who described their contents in a recorded conversation that has not been published. Neither Sinatra nor Whitney ever spoke about that evening publicly. Not once. Not in any interview either of them authorized. 6 weeks later, Sinatra added, "Didn't we almost have it all?" to his late show set list. He performed it 3 times in Las Vegas that summer. The musicians who backed him said he sang it differently from the songs that had always been his, more carefully, like he was working something out that had not yet resolved. Frank Sinatra died on May 14, 1998. Whitney was 34. She made no public statement. 4 days after the funeral, a handwritten note arrived at the Sinatra home in Beverly Hills. Nancy Sinatra mentioned it once in a 2015 interview with a music journalist. She said the note was short. The closest she could get to describing it was the note of someone who understood what he meant. She did not say what it contained. The journalist did not push. The Tonight Show stage has been rebuilt twice since 1989. The blue curtain went into storage when Carson walked off for the last time in May 1992. The desk stayed. The chair stayed empty in that specific way chairs go empty when the person who defined them is gone. "Didn't we almost have it all?" still plays. On certain mornings, it shows up without warning. In a car, in a waiting room, somewhere in the back of a store. And sometimes the person hearing it stops for a moment. Not because of what it detonates, because of what it means. Frank Sinatra, sitting at the far end of a couch in NBC Studio One at 12 minutes past midnight in March of 1989, was the last person anyone in that room expected to say so. Have you ever had a moment when something you worked your whole life to be good at was reduced to a single dismissive sentence? And you had to decide right then whether to argue or simply prove it? Tell us in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who knows what Whitney Houston meant. Subscribe so you never miss the stories that didn't make it into the official record.